When I was very young in London, Pablo Neruda came to London and read his poetry. And this was when I was going up with a Spanish girl, and she had read Neruda, and she said, we have to go and listen to him. And we went and listened to him, and there was this piece, not one of his most famous poems, but about a mermaid, and it knocked me out. And the way he read it or spoke it, I can't remember, recited it. I don't think he had to read. And I wrote a piece and played it with a few people in London, and then recorded it with this Italian trio. And at that time, when I made the record, I had met Marioness already. So we were following what was happening in Chile, and as you probably know, the coup d'etat here, Pinochet's coup, was in September 1973. So I made another piece, also inspired by Neruda, which is called in Spanish No hay olvido, and I translated it a bit freely as No Forgetting, which were both inspired by Neruda and by, this terrible thing that had happened in Chile, with thousands of people being tortured and killed. So, yeah, those are pieces that I remember.
You're listening to Africa, off Martin Joseph's 2017 album, The Day of the Rainbow. We'll be back in a moment. And we're back. My name is David Raban, and I'm here with Martin Joseph. His newest album is called The Day of the Rainbow. You've performed in many places across the world. Where have you performed, and which was your favorite?
Well, mainly I played in countries where I've lived, which include Italy, apart from Britain, where I've not played much. I've played a couple of times, really, only, since leaving there in 1970. But I was 18 years in Italy, so I played a lot in Italy. Traveled to Switzerland to play, a gig in Germany, something in France as well. Yeah, and then we came to Latin America, where we lived in Peru, in Dominican Republic, and in Bolivia. And I formed groups and played in all those places, as well as teaching in the conservatorios. I'm one of the few people, maybe not so many in the world actually, who have taught a lot in conservatorios, never having studied in one.
I tried my best to find out information about your life. From what I could tell, you were a fairly nomadic musician, as you've discussed, although you did live in Italy for a long time and in different places, and living around the world. As I mentioned before, you recorded your eponymous 1973 album in Rome, and apparently you stayed there until 1988.
Yes, that's right.
You also lived in Peru, where you released your 1996 album, Mystery Box, and you released your 1997 album, More Light, in Bolivia. Can you tell us a little bit more about those albums and what it was like to create them, especially two back-to-back? Did you have a backlog of compositions that you've been working on for a long time? And what distinguished those albums?
To some extent. But also, particular musicians and particular groups invite a special kind, a particular kind of writing. So not that much. The pieces I play in trio, many are often pieces that I played all my life or for a long time. Although not the original composition. The original composition I write for that group, But when I formed the La Paz Jazz Ensemble, which actually is not from Peru, it's from La Paz, Bolivia. It was a kind of group that I had been wanting to form for a long time. And the difficulty in places like London or Rome, where I lived, is, you want to have really good players. And the kind of music I had in mind needed quite a bit of rehearsal. And, if there isn't a very well-paid gig, nobody's going to do a rehearsal in London. I suspect in New York it's not much different. And Rome, it was the same. And somehow, maybe the distances were smaller also, which is also a factor, If you can get to a place in 10 minutes, it's different from having to travel across a big city, So whatever, in Bolivia, I was able to form a 7-piece group with trombone, 2 saxes, and at the top of the range, instrumental range, really I would have liked to have a trumpet. But actually, necessity sometimes gives you nice solutions. Since I couldn't find a trumpet, I had quena and zampoña, the Andean flutes at the top. And that was very nice. And the reason I write that I'm interested in that size of group, it's something that Charles Mingus loved, as a sort of size of group. It's large enough, with 4 horns, we say in jazz language. With 4 horns, it's large enough to write interesting stuff. And at the same time, it's small enough that you can give a lot of space to improvisation. Because, if you have a 15-piece group, you can't give everybody a solo in all the pieces. Somehow you do, you have solos, but you depend more on arrangement. And somehow with 15 groups also, it has to be more precise. And I like it to be a little bit like Duke Ellington or Mingus, not because the music is particularly like theirs, but I hear in them a love of an ensemble, which in feeling is very much together, but where you can really hear the individual voices. And that means it's not mechanically together. There are slight imprecisions, and I believe they were part of the philosophy that, so you could hear very well all the individual, it's collective, but also everybody's individual voice comes out. And so I love that size, and I've maintained it here in Chile, where I do use trumpet.
Are there things that you miss about the United Kingdom, Rome, Peru, or Bolivia? Maybe the La Paz Jazz Ensemble that you founded. Are there things that you think about looking back about those experiences and they go over in your head maybe a few times? Yeah. I know I do, and I'm still pretty young.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that you've been asking about what I do, and so I've been talking to you about what I've done and so on. But also, just those places are fascinating. In Italy, I was very lucky in Italy because I did a lot of work as giving workshops. And when I was in Italy, I did this with other people. I we were a group of musicians who formed a music school. That was also a great experience in Rome, in a popular area of Rome called the Testaccio. And it was a school which was open to all the musics, because I don't much like the idea of jazz schools. Just as I don't like classical conservatories, which are only about classical music from Bach to Debussy, more or less. A lot of people felt like that, and we formed a school which was, there were classical teachers, there were jazz teachers, there was somebody involved in Italian folk music. I don't think there were rock people at that time. I bet there are now. But, and that was a great experience. So I had incredible experiences, like spending a week in Venice, imagine, paid to be a week in Venice. Can you imagine? And, I think I told you I studied history of art. That was a wonderful present. And just apart from the art, just walking in Venice and walking in Rome where we lived, but Venice and Florence, Siena, I was paid to be in these places. And, the workshop would be 2 or 3 hours a day. It was usually an intensive workshop, like 5 days, 6 days, with a concert by the students at the end. And that was also great. And you learn a lot also from other students. And then the places, the places are also an influence on your music. and the things you listen to. So in Italy, I also got to know traditional Italian musics, like there were some wonderful musicians from Sardinia, you know, in one of the islands off the Mediterranean coast of Italy. And they had people who played a wind instrument with 3 reeds. And so one was like a pedal, and the others were kind of variations on this pedal. And it was played, and there were no pauses. It was played with circular breathing. And all this, you learn from all these things. And imagine in Peru, in Bolivia, the kind of musics that I was able to hear, you know, wonderful. And here also, well, I also love the traditional folk music. I know less well, but the kind of music inspired by folk music, like do you know Violetta Parra?
No, I'm not familiar.
Oh,
I have a long musical education ahead of me.
Well, Violetta Parra was she was sister of the well-known poet Nicanor Parra, who died aged 102 recently. But Violetta was active in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and died in the late 60s. But she collected folk music. She went to listen to folk music in obscure parts of Chile, and she was an incredible, talented woman who was also a very interesting visual arts person. She made tapestries and paintings. She wrote the texts of her music, which are nowadays published as poetry, and her music is very, very beautiful. She sang and accompanied with the guitar. Her most famous song is probably Gracias a la Vida. So I, listened to and admired her, a man called Victor Jara, who was murdered by Pinochet's regime, but who was a wonderful singer-songwriter also. Groups, Quilapayún was one, another one was Inti Illimani. I knew because they went into exile. Both those groups went into exile, and they were in Italy, so I knew them. So you learn from all these things. I mean, in fact, I often use poetry or music or painting to somehow to inspire pieces. Like I have 3 pieces for Matisse. The painter.
Yes, you have for Matisse 1, 2, and 3 off of your Pacific ensemble.
That's right. My goodness, that's right, yes. Do you know why? Do you know why I wanted to dedicate a piece to why I thought about Matisse?
I saw the documentary, but I did not have time to translate the Spanish into English. So that was one part that I could not quite get. But I would love if you told us the story.
Yeah. Well, the Matisse, towards the end of his life, he had a long life, and towards the end of his life, he wrote a book called Jazz. It has the text is written in his hand. I mean, it's printed, of course, but you read it in his handwriting, and it's illustrated with with late works by him, and I think for Matisse, jazz was a symbol of freedom, I think.
2 years after you had written More Light with the La Paz.
Yes. You may know about More Light.
Yes. Well, I'm just saying that 2 years later, you moved to Santiago.
Right, sorry.
Rumor on the street is that you moved for a lady.
It's no secret.
So how did that work out?
She's worth it, I have to say. She's great. Well, we met in Rome years and years and years ago, and we lived in all those places I was talking about together, and she was working for an agency of the United Nations, and as a professional in the United Nations, it's not usual for professionals to work in their own countries. I would say it's not policy even. So we worked in all those countries, and at a certain point we were in Bolivia, and her parents were getting old and unwell, and she wanted to be with them their last years. And so we came in 1998. She took early retirement, and we came back. And we've lived here ever since, yes.
Have you ever written a piece of music for her?
Oh, yeah. Not often, but once. Well, maybe a lot of the pieces I write are